about 15 more minutes today, if y'all don't mind, and make a little extra cash. But the churches say, no, don't do that. Turn with me tonight to Genesis chapter 18. Genesis chapter 18. Tonight the message is entitled The Moab Connection. I have to keep reminding myself, we're studying the book of Ruth. I don't think we've read a verse. We have read a verse or two in Ruth, but we're sneaking up on it. We looked at the Jewish connection last week, and then starting in Genesis 11 and then in 12, God promised in Genesis 3:15, when Adam and Eve sinned, God says, okay, here's a little thumbnail of my plan. Eve, you kind of got us into this. We're going to let you get us out. That's kind of, you're going to become the mother of all living. And one of your children is going to be the deliverer. He's going to be the one. You're going to find I'm a science fiction nut, and one of the theatrical productions of great science fiction in the last few years. It's been a 3-act series called The Matrix. And it picks up on a very common theme that's throughout all kinds of literature about someone being the anointed one, someone being the chosen one. And the question in the Matrix throughout most of the movie, the first part of the movie, is whether or not this particular fellow who seems to have fallen into a storyline that he would not have chosen for himself, whether or not he's the one. Jesus is the one. He's really is the one. And he's the one that God was talking about in Genesis 3:15. And when God chose Abraham, Abraham was to be the first member of what we know today as the Jewish nation, the first Jewish person. And we're going to see something today that I think is a little humorous. I really would like to talk. I wish I had a good, close Jewish friend. I'm going to broach this with a rabbi someday, and hopefully he doesn't scald me. It seems to me to be a little stereotypical, certainly. I'll admit that. I don't think it's racist, but I'll share that with you in a minute. I'm not afraid to broach it. I don't think it's unkind, but it does deal with stereotypes about Jewish people. Stereotypes about Baptist preachers is that we're pretty much all balding and fat. So I'm right in there with that. I'd like to shrug the part of that identity. If there's going to be a one, if there's going to be a chosen one, then he needs to have a family to be born into. So Abraham, you're the one. All the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through you. And whoever blesses you, I'm going to bless them. Whoever curses you, I'm going to curse them. And he says, my intention is to bless everybody that wants a blessing through you. So we have a nation there, a people. His name was Abram in the beginning, which means exalted father. Married to a young Jewish lady who just became a Jewish lady named Sarai. Well, if you remember from last Sunday, or if you remember from having read this passage or this story before, that there was a tagger along as God needed to get Abram to the land of promise. He needed to get him on stage, in other words. This is where it's going to happen in what we think of today as Israel. Need to get him on stage, okay? So he says, I want you to leave the land of Ur, which is the land of the Chaldean people. He says, I want you to leave there and come to a place that I'll show you. Abraham is described as being a stranger in a strange land. Canaanites dwelt there, very, very different kind of people. There was a straggler, a hanger-on. Do you remember that Abraham brought a family member with him? Remember that? Lot. Lot is his nephew. He brings Lot with him. Well, it kind of complicates things. So I've heard some people say, well, God didn't tell him to bring Lot. Well, that's true. It's a little bit, I wouldn't take that route in preaching or deciding what I believe, because I have a hard enough time doing what God has told me, if I have to start paying attention to what he didn't tell me, I'm really sunk. So he didn't tell Abraham, well, don't bring Lot. For some reason or other, and we don't really, he had a fondness for Lot. He brought him along with him. Let me fill in a little bit of the passage here. What we're talking about is that God began blessing Abraham, or Abram at this time, almost automatically, and thereby also blessing Lot. Came to a place where, as their family grew, and they had servants, they had people who would come in, and we think of people today as being employers and employees, but they didn't really have that kind of job structure back then. When you came in to work for someone in this day, you pretty much became like an indentured servant. Remember we studied that when we studied colonial history in high school? A lot of people, in order to come to the new world of America, would sell themselves or become indentured servants. They were slaves. And we talk about black slaves, but the first slaves that came to America were white people. And they would say, I will work for you 5 years, 2 years, 10 years, if you will pay my passage over there. So that's how a lot of people, many of your relatives and mine, the way they got here was that they probably were not wealthy people. They just said, I'll pick your cotton, I'll hoe your corn, I'll be, and so it wasn't really thought to be a demeaning thing. Of course, you could wind up with working for someone who was a bad person, and it was always bad. But what it was more than anything else was an opportunity. And most people in that situation, when your contract was up, you were a free person, and you could start your own way. Now, that doesn't mean that slavery's good or that slavery's okay. This is not typically slavery, and it certainly has nothing to do with what the black people were subjected to. Theirs was against their will. There was no contract. They were captured and brought. They were prisoners, and they were brought here against their will and forced to serve with no promise at all of freedom. So there are some relations, but really no comparison when it comes to the morality of the issue. But Abraham and Lot, they're people. More and more people wanted to attach themselves to them. There's no indication that they captured people or that they forced people, but that people would come in and say, we want to be included in your clan. And so it kind of grew like that, because we know that Abraham didn't have any children. Lot only had 2 daughters. But their tribe increased otherwise. And it came to where there wasn't enough, that the people who were part of Lot's clan, the people who were part of Abram's clan, clashed. And so Abram came to him and said, I'll tell you what, you pick here, we'll divide the country up, and if you want to stay here, and I'll take the other. If you want to stay there, then I'll take this one. So Lot chose the best for himself, the plains, the lush lower plains of the Negev. Now today the Negev is a desert. Back then it was a place, it was where all the water captured, down in that on the plain. Well, it says along there that Lot began to associate himself with the cities of the plain. The 2 primary cities were and Gomorrah. Now when we mention those 2 cities, we think of corrupt, evil places. But let's look here, stopping at Genesis 18:23. Pardon me, let's go back a little bit. Verse 20. Genesis 18:20. The Lord said, because of the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is coming to me, and if not, I will know. Let's kind of do a commentary as we go through. There's a way of revealing truth to us about God in the Bible that we need to understand, and sometimes what we have labeled it is as anthropomorphic language. Anthropos means man. Anthropology is a study of man. And what it means is that sometimes the best way for us to understand God is to pretend he's a man and think of him in terms of a man. So here it looks like God doesn't know what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. He's heard some rumors. Somebody's gossiped to him, and then somebody's come and says, you know, things pretty bad down in Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, well, I didn't know that. But I'll go down there and find out. You see, that all sounds very human. Doesn't sound very much like God, though, does it? Kind of, you know, if I'd been standing there and Abram is listening to him, they're kind of having a prayer. This is happening in the middle of a prayer session or a revelationary session. If I were Abram, I would say, wait a minute. You're supposed to know everything. You mean there's something going on down here and you got to go investigate it? You got to go find out? So, but here, it's just a way, it's just like saying that a clock has a face. Clock doesn't have a face. It's got a front. Clock has hands. No, clock really doesn't have hands. Not hands. It's got little wire things that kind of go around and point at the big hand, the little hand. So we talk about a clock like it was a human being. But it's not a human being. It's not even close. But it's a way of understanding things. That's very, very common in the Bible, to talk about God like he doesn't know something. He's got to go find out. So it's just a way of giving us a place where we can get a handle. It's the only way that God could communicate with Abram. Abram was a very primitive man. So don't let that snag you up, and if you never have even looked at it, don't let me snag you up. Verse 21 says, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is coming to me, and if not, I will know. And the men turned their faces from thence. There are two men that came, and went towards Sodom. But Abraham, it says here now, his name has already been changed, stood yet before the Lord. So these angels have gone off, and they're evidently the investigatory committee. Verse 23, and Abraham drew near and said, wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? This is before the Mosaic law. There's not any divine law. There's no Bible. There's no written record. We have no idea. We have no way of understanding here what Abraham understood as a righteous person or a wicked person. Just from our conscience, as human conscience, I think that we're being created in the image of God. We have a very basic understanding of right and wrong without any laws at all, even without the Bible. I think that's something that betrays us often. It gives us away. Well, I didn't know that was wrong. I know throughout my life there has been that small voice in the back of my mind that says, don't do that. Don't do that. Have you ever seen the cartoons? This little angel on this corner, he's dressed in white, and this over here, he's got a pitchfork, and he looks like the devil. Yeah, go ahead and do it. Well, that's almost more real. That's no actuality in that. Both of those are me. There was a black minister once who was talking about how he was really doing a very fine exposition of Romans 7, where it talks about the two natures of man. Paul was talking about, I know what I ought to do and I don't do it. There are things that I know I shouldn't do and I do them. This black preacher was using an illustration saying it's like two dogs inside of me that are fighting. There's a black dog and a white dog. And the black dog, not because he's black, but it's just a reference. He represents the bad part of life, and the white dog the righteous part of life, and not because he's white. And they're fighting all the time. They're fighting. He says there's a war going on inside of me. After the message or after the lesson, someone came up to him and says, preacher, which one of them dogs in your life, which one of them dogs wins the most fights? The preacher says, the one that I says sick 'em to. The one that I says sick 'em to. Yeah. See, there you go. There are two dogs. It's like two natures. And that really makes it sound kind of like you and I are innocent. That, whatever you two dogs figured out, and I'll do whatever y'all tell me. But it's not. It's which one I says sick 'em to. That's the one who wins. And that's really what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, I'm not saying that I'm not responsible for my bad choices or my sins. He says, it's just, I've got this war going on, and he says, I'm just being honest with you. I lose almost every time. That's what Paul says. He owns up. He fesses up. So here, Abraham comes to God. Obviously, God has already pronounced that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah are wicked. But you know, there aren't any policemen, there aren't any judges, there aren't any governors, there's no presidents, there's no king of this area much. If he is, he's just a king of his own castle. There's no moral structure, there are no laws, there's no government, there's not any written rules, there's no scripture, and God has revealed himself very little. So to come up and call these people are very wicked, well, what does that mean? There are some hints and clues about the fact that maybe the people of Sodom were homosexuals, that their great sin was homosexuality. There are some hints and clues, and we can piece some things together about that. But it never does say that Gomorrah had that same